Greetings, class. I hope you guys are doing well. I'm here to go over chapter 4 with you. And chapter 4 is essential to our book. And a lot of you guys are writing about the Second Amendment, the Bill of Rights. And I think chapter 4 has a lot of key points in it. Specifically, a lot of people argue why our founding fathers have the Second Amendment. And this book clarifies that very, very well. So in England, the way it worked is that the king was basically ordained by God. So if you were the king of England, God gave you that position of power. So whatever you said, everybody had to listen. And this became very controversial and convoluted. So for example, one of the most famous kings in England was King Henry VIII. Now, he was Catholic, and he was married to a woman who could not give him a child, a male child, and he wanted to pass on his legacy and his heir. And he realized he couldn't divorce her, and he realized if he became Protestant, he would be able to divorce her. So what he did was he became a Protestant. He divorced his wife. Now, the issue with this is that if the king becomes Protestant, an entire country has to become Protestant, because that's the way it works. So our founding fathers were coming from this place where kings had absolute power. And on page 101, it talks about this, where King James II, I believe, he was Catholic and he wanted to unarm the Protestants. And he found out that 98% of the country was Protestant. So our founding fathers were coming from this place where the king could take away your weapons. If the king said you had to belong to this religion, then you had to belong to this religion or you'd be killed. And I'm skipping over a lot of history. This is trenched in history. And our founding fathers had this belief that people should have the right to govern themselves, that people should have a right to bear arms, and the government should not be able to take their guns away from them. And because they were coming from England, they had this belief. So this is where they're from. Now, some people would argue that times have changed, guns have changed, and I think that's a fair argument. Our founding fathers weren't around guns that could fire, 100 rounds in just a couple seconds. We have guns today that that are way different than what they were using. In their time, if they shot a gun, they'd be lucky if they hit something 50 yards away, and there'd be so much smoke they wouldn't even know if they hit it in the first place. So guns have changed, people have changed. I think those are strong arguments for the topic, and it really gets into the Second Amendment. And also, I really like this chapter because it gets into the Founding Fathers. And if you look very carefully at the Second Amendment, it says, at the very end shall not be infringed. However, our founding fathers had a lot of gun control in their time. Our founding fathers were very strict on guns. They had a lot of rules for guns. Now, some of their rules were very extreme. They're not what we would see as rules today. However, one thing they did in their time is they required all people, all men between 18 and 45 to have a gun. So that would be pretty crazy if Donald Trump came on the news tonight and said everybody should own a gun. If you don't own a gun, you're going to go to prison, 18 to 45. But they wanted people to be armed at all times. Reason being is because they lived in a place where there were the British who might attack them at any moment. There were the French. There were Native Americans. There might be slave rebellions. So they wanted people to be armed at all times. And in essence, that's a form of gun control, but it's not what we would typically see as gun control. Another thing they did on page 113 at the bottom is they had impressment laws. An impressment law was something like this. So if you were on a battlefield, and remember, there was no army, there were no traditional battlefields. A battle might be happening on your farm. And impressment laws worked like this, where if there was a battle on your farm, the American troops could come to your house and you were supposed to give them your gun. Now, they would bring your gun back. But essentially, the military could take your gun away from you if they needed to use it for war. And it's very interesting that our founding fathers are for this when they said, shall not be infringed. And I wonder how that would work today if we went to war with another country. Let's say we went to war with North Korea and Donald Trump said, you know what, guys? We need all of you guys to give us your guns because we don't have enough to fight North Korea. But don't worry, we'll give your guns back. So they did have extreme laws, and that is a form of very interesting gun control. And I find that a very fascinating part of this book. I don't know how they were able to do that when they were trying to stop government takeover, but they were allowing people to take away their guns. So there's a lot of weird things about our founding fathers that this book points out that I think are very strong. Another thing is they did ban guns. They banned certain types of guns, but not for the reasons you would think. I'm talking about 115. They banned a gun called a matchlock, and the reason why is they said it didn't fire fast enough, and they weren't effective in fights against Native Americans. So this is backwards thinking, and I never thought about this until I read this book. Some people would say that if George Washington came back today and he saw the types of guns we have today, he would be outraged. He would say, there's no need for a gun like this. But chances are maybe the founding fathers would have really liked the guns we have today because they could fire fast and they could kill a lot of people. And our founding fathers are colonizers. They're trying to take over a country. And so maybe they would really like the guns we have today. And I never thought about this until I read this chapter. And I think that's a very strong point. Another thing they did was they required open carry. So if you had a gun, you had to have that gun on you at all time. If you were in school, if you were in church, you had to have the gun on you, which is a bit strange. But you have to remember this. They were living in a time where the British might attack you, where Native Americans might attack you, where you might be attacked by a grizzly bear. I don't think most normal people wake up and they're worried about the British attacking them. They're worried about being attacked by a grizzly bear. So I think our world has changed, and it might be fair to say that the world is not as dangerous as what our founding fathers lived in. However, I think that depends on where you live. If you live in a place like Chicago or Cleveland, where there's high crime rates and high homicides, then I think you might be in a scarier place than we are today, than they were in their time. But they did encourage open carry. And there's two other points that I find very fascinating here. One is on page 116. So our founding fathers they prevented certain people from having guns because they didn't want them to have them. They did not want Native Americans, Indians to have guns. And the reason why is they didn't want those guns to be used against themselves. And I don't want to take sides. I don't want to take any positions. Some people might say that makes sense. They wouldn't want Native Americans to have guns because the Native Americans would then use their guns against them. So that might make sense to them. And then they also banned slaves or people who became free from having guns. And places like Virginia, there were more slaves than there were white settlers, so they didn't want slaves to have guns. And our founding fathers had very cruel views of people. They found slaves to be property. They weren't even people. They found you. I'm doing a lot of history here, and I'm not a history teacher, but our country has always had a very nasty view of African Americans. We have a long history of that. Some of the things our founding fathers believed that slaves were not people; they were 3/5 of a person. There was a Supreme Court decision called Dred Scott, where a slave became free. He traveled up north, and he said, "You can't send me back south because I'm not property. I'm a person." And the Supreme Court at that time declared he was not a person, he was property, and they sent him back. So they had very horrific views of people during their time. And some people might say, why would the founding fathers want slaves to have guns if they were going to be used to hurt them or fight against them? But know this, our founding fathers banned Native Americans from having guns. They banned African Americans from having guns. And also, I find this really interesting, in a place like Maryland, they banned Catholics from having guns. Maryland was a Protestant state. They didn't want Catholics to have guns. And then if you look down on page 116, the next paragraph, it says they banned loyalists from having guns. So if you were still loyal to the British Crown, they didn't want you to have a gun. So after the people took over America from the British, they felt that if you were still loyal to Britain, you shouldn't have a gun. Now, the issue with this is that 40% of people here were loyal to the British. Now, I'm bringing this up because of this, and I find this very fascinating. I've never thought about this until I read this chapter, and it really complicates some of the conversations we've had. Our founding fathers in the Second Amendment said, shall not be infringed, that people have a right to bear guns. This is a right. But They infringe upon the rights of Native Americans, African Americans. They infringe upon the rights of Catholics in Maryland and Loyalists, 40% of the country. So then you start asking yourself who did have guns. So it's interesting that our founding fathers were saying that all people should have guns, or men should have guns, but they were banning a lot of people from having guns in their time. I find that very, very fascinating. And lastly, here's a good topic we haven't really talked about. Something called safe storage laws. So if you own a gun, it should be in a safe. It should be put away from your children. And our founding fathers did have safe storage laws. So for example, they had gunpowder. They didn't have bullets like we have today. And so they required, if you had gunpowder, you had to keep it in your attic. And that way, if it blew up, it only blew up your roof. If you kept it in your basement, it would blow up your entire house, which makes sense. It makes perfect sense, but they were passing laws for safe storage. So I find this really, really interesting, this part of the book, because we've read the Second Amendment, which is so important to this topic. And our founding fathers are saying men should have guns, that these rights should be protected. It is a right. It's a God-given right. But at the same time, they were passing a lot of interesting gun control laws in their time. And it just gives a different perspective on the subject. So I really like this chapter. I think it's important to read and understand. Thank you for listening.